This is Taking Stock with Pimm Fox and Kathleen Hayes on Bloomberg Radio.
It almost sounds like music you could play as you watch the tanker cars go by with full of oil and crude. Let's find out what's going to happen to all that oil and crude with Dan Eberhart. He is the chief executive of Canary Oil, and he joins us from Denver, Colorado. Dan, it's a pleasure to have you with us here on Bloomberg. Tell us about Canary Oil. What does it do, and what is the connection between Canary and the export of U.S. crude?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on today. Canary is one of the largest independent wellhead companies in the country, and we actually are an oilfield service company, so more like a Halliburton or a Schlumberger, less like an Exxon or a Conoco. But we have been very outspoken in pushing to have the crude oil export ban lifted. We think it's an outdated law and doesn't make sense, and as the U.S. is trying to push free trade and be a responsible free trader globally.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
The ban, of course, started 40-some years ago in the 70s. We had, the oil embargo, and so subsequently, people, we've got the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, et cetera. People who are in favor of keeping it say that if we drop it, the price of crude oil will go up and will hurt U.S. refiners, and that will raise the cost of gasoline for U.S. consumers.
Well, I think part of that's true. I mean, I think really the net beneficiary, and as I've met with 15 to 20 members of Congress on this and spoke with many other people up on the Hill about it in the Department of Energy and such, really I think that the net beneficiary of this law is not really the U.S. consumers. The net beneficiary is the refiners in the U.S. Study after study shows it will actually reduce the price of gasoline at the pump. One thing that people don't normally know is that the price of gasoline you pay at the pump in the U.S. has a much stronger correlation with the Brent price than the WTI price. So, presumably if you can add more supply to the worldwide market and bring down those trade barriers in the U.S., more supply will equal, a price that's at least nominally lower.
For all consumers?
Yes.
For all consumers. Okay. Yes. So I want to understand, though, Dan, how does a graduate of Vanderbilt with 2 degrees in economics and political science plus a graduate of Tulane Law School, how do you end up in the oil patch in Colorado?
Well, it just happened, and we're really much more focused on Canary as a company is really much more focused on the Bakken in North Dakota, on the Permian in West Texas, and the Mid-Continent in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and places like that than Colorado these days. But it basically kind of backed into it. Moved to Phoenix as a result of Hurricane Katrina, got involved with somebody who was investing in oil and gas, and things kind of took off from there.
All right. So let me just follow up on this because this is interesting since you have firsthand experience in the Bakken.
Yes.
Tell us what is different. If we went and visited now, what would look different than it was, let's say, 2 years ago?
2 years ago. Well, certainly the prices we're getting for services have fallen, in the 15 to 30% range, depending on what service we're providing. I think the housing is starting to ease up, although there's been a bit of a lag there. But the traffic is considerably different. The amount of overtime and folks working 100 hours a week, folks have got a little more off time. I think that, it's a much more conservative environment and is a lot less, kind of like the gold mine era in the 1850s in San Francisco. The gold rush is over, so to speak. I think it's more about, harvesting, from existing oil fields and getting production from existing wells in the Bakken. So it's a bit slower than it was in, say, summer of 14.
Well, that's so interesting, isn't it? Because when oil prices started falling, first of all, no one knew how low they'd get or how fast they'd get there. A lot of economists, it'll help consumers. I don't think people realized how much disruption it would cause on the supply side. Does that make it more important? Does it help the U.S. oil industry broadly, this global supply? There's actually a glut still, right? That's what a lot of people would argue, if we lift the ban on U.S. exports.
I think nominally. So, look, I mean, we got into starting to push this in late 2013, early 2014, before the oil bust. Look, I think the repealing the crude oil export ban, I think it makes sense of it in light of what we're doing with Iran. I think it makes sense in light of what we're doing with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think it makes sense in the medium and long term for the U.S. oil industry to provide jobs and economic activity in the U.S. I think it's nominally useful in terms of the the oil bust or the oversupply in the market currently and the downturn in the U.S. oil industry. I don't think it's an immediate fix for that whatsoever. I think it's more of a long-term. Where do we go when we get energy independent? Where do we go next?
Okay, Dan, a question on the politics, since you have been so involved in this. A move by Senator John Hoeven, who's the Republican senator from North Dakota, shopping the idea of pairing the oil export ban, which a lot of Democrats don't want to lift, with legislation that the Democrats themselves are backing to fully fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Is this going to be the deal maker?
Potentially. I think there's a lot of stuff out there. I actually spoke earlier this week with Senator Lankford, and his idea is to kind of tie it to the highway fund. But I think the Republicans in the Senate, now that it's through the House, are very interested in making something happen this year. And I think we'll see one way or the other. I think we'll see it happen in 2014. There's also Senator Manchin from West Virginia has also got some interesting ideas on things that it can be tied to along as well as Hoeven and Lankford.
Hey, Dan, the Obama administration, though, says they want the Commerce Department to rule on whether the ban should be lifted or not. And, in fact, the White House press secretary, right, Josh Earnest, he said that the Republicans advocating for oil exports shows they are in the pocket of oil and natural gas interests, and that Obama will oppose any Republican-sponsored bill. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think he says that. I think a lot of people forget. Bill Clinton actually lifted the export ban, allowing Alaska to export crude to Russia during his term of office in the 90s. I think a lot of people forget that. Also, the Obama administration has been quietly, 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, they allowed us to export condensate. They now allow crude swaps with in limited circumstances with Mexico. So in their own way, the Obama administration has been slowly letting the air out of the balloon around the edges on this policy. But I think if it gets through the Senate, I don't think Commerce's ruling really matters. It just comes down to, will it be attached to something that the president will or will not veto?
Dan, quick final question. We get the Schlumberger earnings report after the bell today. Is it going to show that the malaise North American drillers are suffering is spreading around the world?
I think so. I mean, I think, look, the U.S., as a free market really shows our success, and we've responded much quicker than the rest of the world in terms of trimming payroll, in terms of limiting overtime, and in terms of reducing our supply chain, and in terms of laying down or stacking up rigs, as we say in the industry. I think that the U.S. is the first and biggest recipient of feeling the decline in the oil price as far as the oilfield service companies. I think internationally it's held up a little bit better as the petrostate oil companies have continued to seek activity.
Dan Eberhart, thank you so very much. CEO of Canary Oil. Taking Stock continues on Bloomberg Radio.